She was just 19 when tragedy struck mid-flight, a day that began like any other but would soon turn into a nightmare no one on board could have imagined. She had always been fascinated by airplanes, the way they cut through clouds as if gravity was merely a suggestion, the roar of engines that could both terrify and mesmerize at the same time, and the calm yet commanding presence of pilots in the cockpit. She had grown up dreaming about flying, reading every book she could find about aviation, watching countless videos about the lives of pilots, and spending hours imagining herself soaring above the clouds. But nothing in her life had prepared her for the moment when she would find herself in the middle of a crisis that would demand every ounce of courage, focus, and quick thinking she had inside her. The day had started like any ordinary flight, with passengers boarding, flight attendants moving up and down the aisles, and the steady hum of the engines preparing to lift them high above the earth. Families were chatting, some passengers were reading, others were dozing off, and the flight crew was performing routine checks. She had taken her seat quietly, perhaps feeling a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation as the plane climbed into the sky. The clouds outside were brilliant and white, stretching endlessly, a perfect backdrop for what was supposed to be a routine journey. The plane seemed steady, the sun reflecting off its wings, creating a dazzling display that could have been almost magical if not for the calm tension that always exists in the air at 30,000 feet. Then, without warning, everything changed. It started with a faint murmur of confusion among the passengers and crew, a sudden tense silence that hung in the cabin like a thick fog. The pilots, who had been in full control just moments before, suddenly appeared unresponsive. No one could immediately understand what had happened. Perhaps it was a medical emergency, perhaps a sudden illness, or something else entirely. The details would later become important, but at that exact moment, they didn't matter. What mattered was that the people in the cockpit, the very people responsible for the lives of 283 passengers, were incapacitated, and the plane was now essentially flying on its own. The realization struck her like a physical blow. Panic began to ripple through the cabin, a subtle vibration at first but growing stronger with every passing second. People looked around, unsure of what to do, their eyes wide with fear, gripping their seats, whispering prayers, or shouting questions that went unanswered. She felt a surge of disbelief. She had been trained in basic safety procedures, knew the fundamentals of what might happen in an emergency, but nothing in her 19 years on this earth could have prepared her for the sight of an entire aircraft teetering on the brink of disaster with no experienced pilot at the helm. Her mind raced. How could this be happening? How could she possibly help when she had never been trained to fly a plane professionally? The roar of the engines seemed louder now, a thunderous reminder of the danger. She looked at the young faces of other passengers, some clutching children, some praying silently, and suddenly, despite her fear, a sense of responsibility took hold. She realized that while she may have been just a passenger, her knowledge of aviation, her hours of studying, her curiosity and practice in simulations, could be the difference between life and death. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to act, but her mind was racing to process the situation logically. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the panic that threatened to paralyze her. The plane was still airborne, its systems automatic but fragile in the absence of experienced hands. The sheer size of the responsibility weighed on her chest like an invisible weight. How could she possibly manage hundreds of lives, all depending on someone so young, someone who was not officially a pilot? But there was no time for hesitation, no luxury to question her own ability. The situation demanded action. She stood, her legs trembling, and made her way to the cockpit, a narrow path filled with startled passengers and crew who whispered frantic warnings and prayers. She felt the tension in the air like electricity, sharp and unyielding, and every step toward the cockpit felt heavier than the last. Inside the cockpit, the scene was surreal. Instruments blinked and beeped, some in warning, others in normal operation, a chaotic symphony of lights and sounds that seemed designed to confuse rather than inform. The pilots sat motionless, straps still fastened, and the controls lay before her, complicated, unfamiliar, and terrifyingly important. She had spent countless hours reading about cockpit procedures, watching videos of takeoffs and landings, even trying flight simulators in her bedroom, but this was real, this was no simulation, and there was no way to restart if she failed. Her hands shook as she touched the controls, her brain a whirlwind of calculations, procedures, and instinct. She tried to recall every lesson she had ever learned, every emergency scenario she had imagined, and every story she had read about people who had faced similar crises. She knew the plane could not remain on autopilot indefinitely, and that without immediate action, the consequences could be catastrophic. Outside, the clouds whirled past, indifferent to the human drama unfolding inside the aircraft. Passengers were holding onto each other, some screaming, some praying, some frozen in disbelief, and all of them looked to her as the only possible hope. The plane rocked slightly in turbulence, a reminder of how delicate their situation was, and she felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. But fear was quickly replaced by determination. She had to take control. She had to focus. She had to act. The responsibility was overwhelming, but the clarity of purpose brought a strange sense of calm. She remembered her training, her simulations, the countless times she had imagined herself in a crisis just like this. Every lesson she had learned, every fear she had faced in practice, now became the tool she needed to survive this impossible moment. Time seemed to stretch, seconds turning into minutes, each heartbeat pounding like a drum in her ears. She adjusted her seat, gripped the yoke with both hands, and began to assess the plane's current trajectory. Every movement had to be precise, calculated, and careful. She monitored the instruments, spoke in calm but urgent tones to the crew, and slowly began to implement the procedures she had memorized. She was terrified, but fear had become fuel, sharpening her focus, heightening her awareness. The plane was responding, albeit imperfectly, but it was responding. Each minor correction, each careful adjustment, was a small victory against the overwhelming chaos that had erupted mere moments before. As the minutes passed, she felt a growing sense of responsibility and courage intertwined. She was just 19, yet here she was, standing between life and death for hundreds of strangers. The weight of that realization could have crushed her, but instead, it steeled her resolve. She knew that hesitation could be fatal, and that panic would only worsen the situation. Every passenger on board was counting on her, and there was no one else. She was the pilot now, whether she had intended it or not, and she could not afford to fail. The engines hummed steadily, the plane began to stabilize, and for the first time, a tiny spark of hope flickered in her heart. This was the moment that defined her, a moment of unimaginable responsibility and raw courage. She was just 19, a young girl with dreams of flying, and yet she had become the lifeline for 283 people. The fear, the chaos, and the uncertainty had all collided at once, but in the midst of it, she discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. Every decision mattered, every calculation was critical, and every second counted. And though the journey was far from over, she had already taken the first, crucial step toward saving everyone on board. With the pilots incapacitated and the plane still soaring tens of thousands of feet above the ground, she knew that she had no choice but to take control. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt as if it could burst from her chest, but in the midst of fear, a strange clarity emerged. She could not allow panic to take over, not now. Hundreds of lives were literally in her hands, and even though she was only 19, she understood that hesitation or doubt could cost everyone on board everything. Every passenger, from the sleeping infants to the elderly with their hands clenched tightly on armrests, looked to her in ways they didn't even know. They depended on her courage, even if they did not yet realize it. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and approached the cockpit controls with a mixture of fear and determination. The moment was surreal, almost cinematic, as though life itself had slowed down, forcing her to notice every detail. The flashing warning lights, the subtle vibrations of the cabin, the faint creak of metal under stress, and the sharp, mechanical hum of the engines. Her hands trembled as she adjusted herself in the pilot's seat, trying to remember everything she had ever learned about flying, about instruments, about autopilot systems, about landing procedures. Her mind raced as she recalled the countless hours she had spent reading manuals, watching videos, and studying aviation simulations. None of it had prepared her for this level of responsibility, yet somehow, the knowledge she had gathered over the years began to surface in an almost instinctual way. She knew she had to communicate clearly with the flight attendants and the passengers, though she also understood that fear was contagious. One wrong word, one misstep, and panic could spread like wildfire. She took another deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm, because she knew that in this fragile balance, calmness could save lives. Around her, the cabin was a mixture of fear and confusion. Passengers whispered prayers, held each other tightly, and occasionally looked at her with wide eyes, sensing that she was trying to take control. Flight attendants moved cautiously through the aisles, their professional composure strained by the unusual situation. She could feel the tension in the air, a thick, suffocating pressure that seemed to press down on everyone. Yet, amid this chaos, a sense of responsibility crystallized in her mind. She realized that even though she was young, even though she had never flown a plane solo in real life, she had to rise to the occasion. She had to do it for the people around her, for the families who trusted the airline, for the infants and children who would never understand what had almost happened if she failed. The autopilot was engaged, but she knew it would not last forever. She studied the controls quickly, memorizing the positions of buttons, the readings of instruments, and the layout of the cockpit. Her fingers hovered over the controls, hesitant but determined, knowing that each movement had to be deliberate, precise, and careful. She began to speak softly to herself, reciting procedures she had memorized, visualizing each step she would need to take to guide the plane safely to the ground. Every second counted, and her awareness of time stretched painfully, each moment feeling like an eternity. Outside the window, the clouds moved swiftly, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within the plane. The world below seemed distant and unreal, a reminder of how high they were, how little margin for error existed, and how incredible the task before her truly was. As she began to familiarize herself with the instruments, she realized how complex the plane truly was. The gauges, switches, and screens were like a foreign language she had studied but never fully mastered. Yet, desperation sharpened her mind. She started with small adjustments, testing the responses of the controls, making minute corrections, and carefully monitoring the effects. The plane responded, though not perfectly, and each small success bolstered her confidence. She began to feel a strange rhythm, a connection with the aircraft as if it was responding to her determination. It was still terrifying, still overwhelming, but for the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she could manage this impossible situation. The passengers continued to react around her, some shouting, some crying, some trying to comfort one another, and she understood that she had to communicate. She needed to give them hope, even if she herself did not yet fully feel it. Her voice, steadying with effort, echoed through the cabin as she instructed them to remain calm, to stay seated, and to trust that help was on the way. She did not lie, she did not claim she had done this before. Instead, she projected confidence, a clarity that was necessary to prevent the panic that could quickly spiral out of control. Every word mattered, every tone mattered. She understood that leadership, in this moment, was as crucial as the mechanics of flying itself. Hours, or what felt like hours, though it may have been only minutes, passed as she continued to manage the plane. She monitored the fuel levels, adjusted altitudes, and stabilized the aircraft as much as possible. Her hands ached, her mind screamed, but she could not afford to stop. She thought of the families on board, imagining their faces, their lives, and the consequences of failure. She could not fail. The weight of responsibility was immense, but it became a fuel, pushing her beyond fear, beyond doubt, and beyond her own limitations. She realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. And she was acting, with every ounce of strength she could summon. As she navigated, she began to notice small patterns in the instruments, subtle changes that gave her clues about the plane's behavior. She learned quickly, adapting to the aircraft's responses, improvising when necessary, and relying on both instinct and knowledge. It was a delicate dance, a balance between risk and control, and each decision she made carried enormous consequences. The storm clouds outside threatened turbulence, and the pressure of altitude pressed against the fuselage, yet she remained focused, refusing to let the natural fear of death paralyze her. She was the pilot now, in every sense of the word, and the lives of 283 people depended entirely on her skill, her judgment, and her courage. She thought of the pilots, who had trained for years to handle crises like this, and felt a profound respect and a surge of determination. If they could guide planes through unimaginable danger, she could find a way to survive this, too. She relied on memory, training simulations, and rapid problem solving, improvising when necessary, correcting mistakes before they could escalate, and always moving forward, always thinking, always acting. Her mind was sharp, alert, and tireless, fueled by adrenaline, fear, and an unrelenting commitment to those around her. With every passing moment, the chaos in the cabin continued, but so did her control. Passengers began to whisper, realizing that someone was taking charge, that hope was possible. The plane, though still in danger, was responding. She could feel it, a subtle but unmistakable sign that her actions were having an effect. This fragile balance, this tenuous grasp on survival, became her entire world, and she embraced it fully, knowing that failure was not an option. The young girl who had boarded a plane like any other passenger was now the guiding hand for everyone on board, a quiet hero whose courage would define the lives of hundreds of strangers forever. With the plane finally stabilizing under her tentative control, she knew the most dangerous part of the ordeal was still ahead. Flying at 30,000 feet is one thing, landing safely on the ground is an entirely different challenge. She had managed to prevent immediate disaster, but the thought of guiding a massive aircraft through descent, approach, and landing was terrifying. She could feel her body vibrating with exhaustion, her hands stiff from gripping the controls, and her mind racing with calculations she had never actually performed in real life. The horizon outside the cockpit window was a mixture of clouds and distant glimpses of the land far below, a reminder of both the impossibly high stakes and the reality waiting for them. Every decision she made now could either bring hundreds of people to safety or lead to a catastrophe she could not undo. She began to study the instruments more intently, tracing each dial and gauge, trying to anticipate how the plane would respond as she prepared for descent. Altitude, speed, flaps, angle of approach, all of these factors were crucial, and any mistake could be fatal. She recalled countless videos she had watched, tutorials she had read, and simulations she had attempted. Every fragment of knowledge became vital, every memory of a landing scenario a lifeline. She had imagined this moment many times before, but never in such raw, terrifying reality. The plane was heavy, filled with 283 souls, each depending entirely on her focus and competence. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her more than gravity ever could, but she knew she could not let it crush her resolve. Turbulence made the descent even more challenging. The clouds outside were thick, and gusts of wind battered the fuselage with sudden force. She could feel the plane shift slightly with each movement of air, a reminder that even in her careful control, external forces could be unpredictable. She adjusted the controls carefully, compensating for each deviation, making tiny corrections that required both precision and calm. Sweat ran down her forehead, her breathing shallow but controlled. She reminded herself to stay calm, to rely on logic and training over fear. Panic would only ruin everything, and she refused to give it a foothold. The cabin behind her was a mix of tension and quiet trust. Passengers had begun to notice that someone was in charge, that calm decisions were being made despite the chaos. Some whispered prayers, some gripped the armrests, and some simply stared wide-eyed at the flight attendants who were trying to maintain order. She realized that, beyond the mechanics of flying, part of her responsibility was psychological. She had to project confidence even when doubt clawed at her from the inside. Every instruction she gave, every word spoken, could influence the mood of the plane, and she carefully modulated her voice to maintain calm. Leadership, she understood, was just as important as the physical act of controlling the aircraft. She ran through the landing checklist in her mind, reciting each step carefully and deliberately. Flaps needed adjustment, landing gear deployment, monitoring the rate of descent, communication with air traffic control, all of these required split-second timing and accuracy. She had never communicated directly with air traffic control during a real emergency, but she remembered phrases and procedures from her studies. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the radio and spoke clearly, identifying herself and explaining the situation. The voice on the other end responded calmly, guiding her with instructions that she followed meticulously. Every word was crucial. Any misstep could create confusion or delay, and delay could be fatal. The plane began its descent. Slowly, each moment stretching into what felt like an eternity. She focused on every detail, the angle of approach, the speed relative to the ground, the alignment with the runway. She could barely see through the thick cloud cover. Her mind was hyper-alert, calculating and recalculating constantly, compensating for wind, weight, and turbulence. She could feel the strain in her arms and shoulders from holding the controls steady, her knuckles white from the pressure. Fear was still there, but it had transformed into a razor-sharp focus. She had no choice but to trust herself and the knowledge she had acquired over the years, no matter how indirect her training had been. Every second brought new challenges. The plane dipped slightly with sudden gusts, and she adjusted with small, careful movements, learning to feel the aircraft as much as she observed the instruments. Her brain was a whirlwind of calculations and instinct, a combination of learned knowledge and raw intuition honed by adrenaline. She visualized the landing in stages, the final approach, the touchdown, the deceleration, the taxi to a safe stop, and treated each stage as a distinct mission. Breaking down the process helped her manage the overwhelming complexity of the task. She reminded herself that one step at a time, one adjustment at a time, could make the impossible achievable. Through the cockpit window, the runway began to appear, faint at first through the clouds and distance, then slowly becoming clearer. Her heart raced, but she maintained composure, double-checking her instruments and preparing for the final approach. She aligned the aircraft, monitored speed, and adjusted flaps and gear deployment. Her hands were steady now, guided by a mixture of adrenaline, concentration, and determination. The plane was responding well, and for the first time since the emergency began, she allowed herself the briefest flicker of hope. The runway was near, the ground was approaching, and she could see that her careful calculations and deliberate actions were paying off. She had to resist any urge to rush, to panic, or to second-guess her decisions. Every passenger's life depended on her ability to remain calm and precise. She felt a strange connection with the aircraft, as though it was cooperating with her in this extraordinary moment. The sounds of the engines were now familiar, the vibrations under her hands a source of information rather than fear. She could almost sense the plane's behavior, predicting how it would respond to every adjustment she made. She was not just reacting, she was anticipating, improvising when necessary, and guiding the aircraft with a combination of knowledge, instinct, and sheer courage. Finally, the plane touched down, the wheels meeting the runway with a force that reverberated through the fuselage. Her hands tightened on the controls as she carefully engaged the brakes and maintained alignment, slowing the aircraft without abrupt movements. The runway stretched ahead, and she guided the plane safely to a complete stop. A collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the cabin, though she barely noticed, her focus still on ensuring that every detail of the landing was handled correctly. Passengers looked around in disbelief, some hugging each other, some crying, some silently thanking the young girl who had guided them through what could have been a tragedy. As the plane came to a stop, she allowed herself the first real moment to breathe. Her body was trembling, her mind exhausted, yet a profound sense of accomplishment surged through her. She had faced the unimaginable and had not faltered. She had navigated the plane through stormy skies, turbulence, and an emergency situation that would have overwhelmed even the most seasoned pilots. Every decision, every adjustment, every moment of courage had led to this miraculous landing. Though only 19, she had become a hero in that cockpit. A lifeline for 283 people who would never forget her bravery. The plane had come to a stop, but the ordeal was far from over. She remained in the cockpit, hands still on the controls, heart still pounding, as the reality of what she had just accomplished began to settle in. Relief washed over her in small, uneven waves, but there was no time to fully relax. She could hear the cautious movements of passengers in the cabin, whispers of disbelief and gratitude, the soft murmur of flight attendants checking to make sure everyone was okay. She had guided the plane through the most dangerous situation imaginable, and every passenger was still alive, every family still intact. Yet the enormity of what she had done weighed heavily on her young shoulders. 19 years old, and she had just performed a feat that would be remembered for decades. As she finally unclasped her seatbelt and stood, her legs wobbled, betraying the physical and emotional strain she had endured. Flight attendants approached, their faces a mix of awe and relief. Some clutched her hands, others hugged her, their voices trembling as they thanked her for saving the lives of everyone on board. She felt a flood of emotion herself, fear, exhaustion, relief, and pride all tangled together in a way that made her almost dizzy. Her young mind struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. The responsibility, the tension, the sheer improbability of surviving and controlling the plane had consumed every thought for what felt like an eternity. And yet here she was, standing amid the aftermath, realizing that she had actually done it. Passengers began to look around at one another, slowly emerging from their state of shock. Some hugged, some wept silently, and some simply stared, as if trying to process that the catastrophe they had feared had been averted. Their eyes, wide with disbelief, often found her, and she felt a strange mixture of humility and awe. She had not sought to become a hero, had not imagined herself in this role beyond childhood daydreams, yet circumstances had thrust her into the position, and she had risen to the challenge. She realized that heroism was not about age, experience, or training, it was about courage, focus, and the willingness to act when no one else could. The airport emergency crews approached as the plane taxied to a complete stop, personnel moving quickly to ensure the safety of everyone on board. Medical staff checked on the passengers and crew, making sure no one had suffered injuries during the turbulence or descent. She answered questions calmly, recounting the steps she had taken, though she struggled to fully articulate the internal storm she had just weathered. Each person she spoke to looked at her in astonishment, their eyes wide with admiration and disbelief. It was a surreal moment, strangers treating her not as a 19-year-old girl, but as someone who had accomplished the impossible, someone who had saved lives in a way most people only read about in stories. News began to spread quickly, even before she had fully exited the plane. Passengers shared their experiences, describing how a young girl had taken control and landed the plane safely. Social media buzzed with incredulity, journalists called for interviews, and the story captured the imagination of people around the world. She, however, felt a mix of emotions. Pride was present, yes, but so was humility. She did not feel like a celebrity or a legend, she felt like a person who had simply done what had to be done in a moment of crisis. Yet she also understood that the impact of her actions would resonate far beyond the passengers on that flight. It was a moment that would inspire, that would remind the world that courage can come from anyone, anywhere, regardless of age or experience. In the days that followed, the story grew. Interviews captured her calm explanation of the events, but no words could truly convey the fear, focus, and determination she had felt. Aviation experts analyzed her actions, describing how improbable it was for someone so young and inexperienced to manage a landing under such circumstances. They marveled at her ability to control the aircraft, communicate effectively with air traffic control, and maintain composure while guiding 283 lives safely to the ground. Yet she remained humble, insisting that she had only done what was necessary, that she had acted out of responsibility rather than bravery. Her voice, calm and measured, belied the intensity of what had actually occurred in the cockpit. Even as accolades poured in, she thought of the passengers who had silently endured the fear alongside her, the flight attendants who had supported her, and the pilots whose sudden incapacitation had triggered the crisis. She knew the story was as much theirs as it was hers. Heroism, she realized, is often collective. One person may take the final action, but the courage, trust, and effort of many contribute to survival. She felt a deep respect for the world of aviation, the training, the discipline, the coordination, and the reliance on teamwork that ensured that even in the most impossible situations, lives could be saved. In her mind, the memory of the descent and landing would never fade. The trembling controls, the flashing warnings, the roar of the engines, the silent prayers of passengers, and the unwavering guidance of her own instincts were burned into her consciousness. She would remember the fear, but she would also remember the strength she discovered within herself. 19 years old, she had been thrust into a moment that demanded a lifetime of courage in mere minutes, and she had risen to the occasion. She had discovered that human determination, focus, and bravery are capable of incredible feats when circumstances demand them. As she reflected on the experience, she began to understand the impact it would have on her own life. She had faced the ultimate test and had survived not only physically but emotionally and mentally. Her confidence in her abilities soared, tempered with the humility of knowing that such a moment might never arise again, yet that she had proven herself capable beyond what anyone could have expected. She realized that her life had been forever changed, not just by the adrenaline or the media attention, but by the knowledge that she had saved hundreds of people, that her choices, courage, and focus had made the difference between life and death. Eventually, the passengers disembarked, each one offering thanks, smiles, and tears. She shook hands, accepted hugs, and nodded quietly as people praised her, all the while absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Families reunited, children clung to parents, and she felt a profound sense of relief and fulfillment. She had been 19 years old, a young girl suddenly responsible for the lives of nearly 300 strangers, and she had emerged victorious, her courage and determination leaving an indelible mark on everyone aboard. The story of that day, the miracle landing, and the bravery of a 19-year-old would ripple across the world, a testament to human resilience, courage, and the extraordinary potential within us all. In the quiet moments after the chaos had passed, she allowed herself to finally breathe, to reflect, and to acknowledge her own strength. She knew that the memory of the flight, the fear, the focus, and the eventual triumph would remain with her forever. She had faced the unimaginable and prevailed, guiding a plane full of passengers safely to the ground when all hope seemed lost. It was a moment that would define her life. A story of courage that would inspire generations. A testament to what is possible when ordinary people are faced with extraordinary circumstances. At 19, she had become more than a passenger. She had become a hero, a beacon of hope, and a living example of the power of determination, skill, and unwavering bravery in the face of impossible odds.